All right, I think we can get started with our second part. As you mentioned, or as we mentioned earlier, page 150 and Leo the Great is kind of where we're going to pick up. That question of the church being a landowner, maybe that's worth mentioning a few things about. So I think it's important to realize that it's hard to judge what happened in history by modern standards. I mean, I would look at this, you would probably look at it and say, the church being a landowner and a political authority is not a very good deal because it means that people who are ambitious politically, people that want to succeed in politics, need to get ordained priests and become cardinals and those sorts of things. And that tends not to play out very well. There's a few instances where it does in history that are rather amusing and rather funny, quite delightful, like the story of St. Charles Borromeo, who was appointed a cardinal, I think, at age 7 or 8, because he was a relative of the Pope. So it was very much nepotism, but in his case it turned out spectacularly well because he was a man who rose to the occasion and became a great bishop and a leader for the entire church and a major figure in the church in Milan. But usually it doesn't work out quite that well, which is why there's a handful of saints from those kind of time periods and not stacks of them. But on the other hand, the Pope being a landowner, so what essentially happens is the Pope makes a trade with Charlemagne. We'll talk about Charlemagne in a little while. But the Pope, there's a group called the Lombards that are invading Italy. They're a Germanic tribe. Those mean Germans, think German Vikings, and you're close to the truth. They invade Italy and they're attacking people and destroying things. And the Pope needs some help. And there's not a lot of help coming from the Eastern Empire, so he eventually makes a deal with Charlemagne because the Franks, the Frankish tribes, had established a kingdom. And if you follow the history a little bit in the rise of Islam, the Muslims move into Spain and start moving north, and they're defeated by a French king, or a Frankish king, that's better to say, a Frankish king named Charles Martel. Charles the Hammer is what his name means. This is commemorated in the Song of Roland, which is one of the more important epic pieces of poetry for the Western Middle Ages. So the Frankish kings beat back the Muslims in France, and then they start organizing a kingdom. And it's the first kind of large-scale return of civilization, you could say, on the continent. It's very, very important for that way. So the Pope is like, well, Charlemagne, you know, you kind of want power and authority, so if you come and kick out the Lombards, I'll name you emperor. And so that's what happens. He comes and kicks out the Lombards, the Pope names him emperor, and as sort of a thank you, Charlemagne gives him a chunk of land in Italy that's kind of from Rome-ish and those areas to the north a little bit. So it's not up by Milan and the Alps and that kind of area, and it's not the way south of Italy. That was much more controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire. It's the environs of Rome. I think it goes up to Florence and across the peninsula and stuff like that. And the popes sort of do this sleight of hand that's funny to modern ears, or that we would discount very, very strongly, but it happened and it was a big deal. So around that time, there was a document that comes out that's called the Donation of Constantine. And this purports to be from the Emperor Constantine, like back in the 300s, so 500 years earlier, about giving the Pope a chunk of land. And modern scholarship has decided that this is a forgery and a fraud and is not from Charlemagne because it doesn't show up is not from Constantine because it doesn't show up in the time of Constantine. It shows up much, much later. But regardless, it happened, and for hundreds of years this was, well, the Pope has the land because it was given to him by Constantine, and that was finally recognized by Charlemagne. So there's bad parts of that, and that the church can get involved in politics and involved politically, But there's also good things as well. It leaves the Pope freedom to govern the church and not be subject to another king. Because in the feudal world of Europe, as it develops, the ties that bind one set of people to the next step, like peasants to the next class of people, which is usually called knights, and knights to lords, and lords to kings, those ties, like you swore an oath to God, and that was considered sacrosanct. Like there's a huge part of the history of the Middle Ages where the Pope gets really mad at one of the emperors. I think it's Frederick Barbarossa, who's much later. But he gets really mad at him, and so the decree that he publishes is this man has lost the right to rule, which means that he annuls, whether you can do this or not, ends up being a big fight, but he annuls all of those oaths that people took to serve the king, which means the nobles are no longer subject to the king, at least in the eyes of the church. And so they're like, this is a party, you know. And the king is like, oh shoot. I mean, that in some sense is a political masterstroke. With one swipe of the pen, he changed the political calculus in a way that very few other things could. On the other hand, it's a political masterpiece and it's not very theological and there's problems with it. But regardless, it's what happened. So the Pope having a kind of authority that's separate from secular authority and that's not under subject of the king is important. And this is actually part of what leads to the modern situation, which I would argue is actually very, very good for the church. And that is that the Pope is technically still a secular ruler. The area that he rules is just very small and doesn't include very many people. So the area that he rules is Vatican City, which oddly enough to us is formally defined as the Vatican, you know, the area that everyone thinks of, plus some extra buildings. There's a few seminaries that are included, like the North American College is part of Vatican City and not part of Rome. So our seminarians, well, we don't have seminarians there now. I think Bismarck still has guys over there, but like they're technically living in Vatican City and not in Italy. Which several times has meant like the Italian police come and knock on the door about something and they've been refused, absolutely. Because Vatican City is a sovereign nation and your police don't have any rights inside these walls. Now it was for like noise disturbances or something if they were hosting a banquet and the neighbors got grouchy, something like that. But like, so the papal basilicas, St. Paul's outside the walls, St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, those are also technically part of Vatican City. So you don't think of it when you're there, but when you cross into the church, you're actually entering another country. So that modern situation leaves the Pope free. I mean, the Pope really doesn't have a lot of temporal power. I mean, for the most part, it's an employment thing. So there's about 3,000 or 4,000 people that work in the Vatican or that are connected with it. And the only citizens of the Vatican are technically the cardinals. And a few other people, the papal diplomats. It turns out that actually one of the most valuable passports in the world to hold is a Vatican passport, because you can get in almost anywhere. We don't think of this in the United States as much because the United States has fairly good relations with a lot of countries, but the passport you hold can determine like how strict the security is when you get somewhere and how much you have to go through to get there. Vatican passports are extremely valuable, but essentially the only people that hold them are the Pope himself and the cardinals and the papal diplomats who are called nuncios. So I think there's only about 500 Vatican passports, and they're extremely judicious about it. You know, if you do things that you shouldn't, the Vatican revokes your passport in a hurry because it's kind of it's the key to a lot of nations. that you can get in when other people can't because of the passport that you hold. So there's challenges and there are benefits. The modern situation has basically freed the Pope up to be a spiritual leader of the people. He's not subject to Italy because he technically owns his own little principality and a few buildings there. And if you heard of the papal, there's a, vacation kind of thing. There's a complex in the hills outside of Rome. Oh, what's it called? Pope Francis has decided not to go there. He stays in Rome. But one of the things that we forget as Americans, is that Rome does not have a nice climate. In August and September, part of the reason that the Italians get 6 weeks of paid vacation is because no one stays in Rome in the month of August. Because it's 95 and 100% humidity and no wind every single day for a month. It's hot. And so everyone goes to the beach. That's an Italian thing. You go either into the mountains, Castel Gandolfo, that's the name of it. So the Pope, that's technically part of Vatican City as well. Oddly enough, I think I've mentioned before that the treaty that governs current relations between the Vatican and Italy was signed by Benito Mussolini, who's not remembered well for basically anything else, but this document has stood the test of time. I mean, basically, the Pope governs these few places, and everything else is left to the Italian state. And it's worked out fairly well for us. Question 6, you can kind of look up that and papal authority. Like I said, the debates about how the Pope interfaces and interacts with secular rulers, those take 1,000 odd years to sort out. I mean, sometimes we like to think that we can solve problems. We don't think in terms of solving them sometime in the next 1,000 years. It's a bit of a different time scheme. So we were talking about the rise of papal authority and how the popes understand themselves. One of the key figures in this is a man named Leo the Great. He gets this title because of his impact in society and in the church. So Rome is failing as a political power, and part of the reason that the Pope sort of steps into politics is because there was no one else. Things are falling apart, the civil infrastructure is decaying, and who has authority to do anything? Well, if you look on the secular side of that question, that answer isn't clear. In some cases, it's nominally part of the Byzantine Empire in the East, but they don't have an army there, and so it's you could declare North Dakota part of Canada all you want and march up and down and say, we're Canadian, we're Canadian. But if there's no Canadian army to enforce it, and it's effectively inside the United States, guess what? It ain't part of Canada. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it looks like on paper sometimes when the reality is different. You have to have someone to be able to enforce your authority and to make it happen. So the political power in the West is declining. Leo the Great is in the 300s, early 400s. 350-ish, somewhere around there. I should have put his dates in. No, maybe more so in the 400s, because his most famous things are this work that's called the Tome of Leo. There's this debate about Jesus and how we talk about him. How do you specify Jesus, two persons in one God, two natures, one person? That kind of debate. That's raging in the Eastern Roman Empire. Pope Leo writes a treatise and basically lays out the language that we use now and the language that gets adopted. And he sends it off as a letter to the East in the Council of Ephesus and the Council of Chalcedon. And he sort of says, this is what I have decided, you should all listen to me. And that's actually what those bishops decide. They say Peter speaks through Leo, and they have a parade, and they're all excited about the Tome of Leo. So again, you could see kind of differing interpretations. So Leo is I wrote a letter, they accepted it, Peter speaks through Leo. Look at that, they affirm papal authority. And the Easterns are like, no, it was just a good idea. It had nothing to do with papal authority. You know, which person is right? It's hard to say, or harder to say. But in the end, this tome of Leo is a kind of singularly important document. One of the things that's unique about Leo is he's the first pope to have significant amounts of his writings and teachings survive. The ones before this, we have fragments and we have people who said what they did, but we don't always have what they said themselves or what they did themselves. Leo is the first one where major portions of his work are preserved, probably because he ends up being known for this. He also, in one of the funniest events of history that puzzles modern historians to no end, there's this group called the Huns. And I'm not sure exactly where they come from. They're one of these Central Asiatic peoples, so the Huns, the Mongols, end up doing this hundreds of years later. But they get uppity and they invade westward. And they end up being very, very successful. They were very, very skilled horsemen. They had bred horses for a long time. They had organization and political unity in a way that the Westerners don't. And the Eastern European Empire doesn't either. So the Huns invade Europe and they're conquering everything. Like they're this unstoppable army, and they get close to the city of Rome, and they were not the nicest people. Kind of in the category of the Vandals and the Vikings and that kind of thing. So the Pope is like, oh shoot, this is bad. And so he decides he's going to go talk to Attila. He's just going to walk up to him and talk. And Attila actually receives him. And they have a conversation, and Attila turns around and goes home. And no one knows what on earth happened. It's not really recorded. Was it, some of the Christian stories talk about the Pope, like, St. Michael appearing and scaring the snot out of Attila. Some of them talk about those kind of things. Some of them, say Leo commanded Attila to leave and he listened. The secular rulers say things like, or the secular historians say things like Attila's army was devastated by this disease or that disease, or their supply lines were running out, or there was a crisis in leadership that he wanted to return home for. But it's sort of this singular event. Like the Pope goes out to talk to this guy who's burning down the countryside. I mean, it would be a little bit like someone, like the Pope making a trip to Russia to talk to Vladimir Putin, and he decided to take all of those armies home and end the war. I mean, it's that kind of figure. And the Pope just sort of waltzes in, and they have some kind of meeting and some kind of conversation that no one knows about, and then they leave. And so the Pope becomes like this hero of society. I mean, he saved Rome from the Huns. So his estimation in the eyes of the Roman people just shot through the roof because the Byzantines were basically worthless. They did nothing. These guys invaded. No army, no help, no support. Oh yeah, you should fight them. With what? Kind of thing. And the Pope sort of is like, well, fine, I'll do it. And he does, and it works. Sometimes I wonder if the Pope walked away from that meeting being like, I did not predict this. It's one of those times in history where you could say the whole thing turns on a dime, and it's not really clear why it did or what happened. The Huns were not Christian. They weren't, how you have that event, and maybe to their credit or to our sort of infinite dismay, they don't say what they did. I mean, none of the accounts of the event, none of the people that write accounts of it were actually there. So all of them are stories that are made up. Sort of like papal elections. It's most likely that most of those that come out today are fabricated. People that are like the inside story of the conclave. Most of that is just made up. It's chimney smoke at best. Some of them might actually know it, but that's another puzzle that we'll save for another day. Anyway, the Council of Ephesus. So there is a controversy in the Eastern Roman Empire, and it happens in the West too. How do you describe Jesus? We use the language now, fully God and fully human, two persons, one God, that kind of thing. And we talk about the hypostatic union. That's all the language that we use. That comes from this council. And oddly enough, this is the council that affirms Mary as the mother of God. And that becomes very, very important because Mary is the mother of Jesus, right? Human mother, sort of strange child in the sense that he is fully God. And the reasoning, so people today, if you were talking about this council, often think that it's about Mary, that Mary is the mother of God. This is one of the holy days of obligation we celebrate on January 1st every year, New Year's Day, Mary, Mother of God. It comes from this council. But actually they were saying something about Jesus. And this is a good lesson for all of the Marian dogmas. Everything that we say about Mary is in reference to Christ. And they say Mary is the mother of God because Elizabeth uses that phrase, Mary, who am I that the mother of my Lord should come to me? When Mary goes to visit her at the visitation. So they use that phrase, Mary is the mother of God, Mary is the mother of the Lord. And because Mary is the mother of a person, the person has to have two natures that are united. Mary wasn't the mother of his humanity, and like his divinity was just sort of separate or added. Although it kind of looks like that, right? Because how can a human be the mother of God? We think in human terms that to be someone's mother, it means you came first, that you were there before they were. Otherwise, you don't have children before you exist. That would be problematic. That'd be kind of weird. You're born and you already have kids of your own. You've never thought about that, I bet.
No, I'm stuck with you. I'll get it.
But regardless, the idea is that because a human person, because people can't be divided, you either have a person or you don't. Right? Like you either exist as a human person or you don't. You're alive or you're dead, those kind of things. Because a person is united, you can't separate out parts of them. And that kind of unity is necessary for Jesus to save us. There's a ton of theological debate behind this. I'm sorry, it probably sounds like it's a little bit of Greek, but suffice it to say that it's incredibly important. This is necessary for the resurrection of the dead of Jesus to work and actually save us and bring us to heaven. Because one of the principles is that if Jesus didn't become human, then what did he save? Because God doesn't need salvation. God doesn't need to save himself. He's already God. He's already saved. And if he doesn't become human, then humanity didn't get saved. And if humanity didn't get saved, then Christianity is worthless. Then you lose the entire thing. But the idea is that because Jesus is fully God and fully human, and those two are united in him as a person, he actually saves us. It can sound like one of the finer points of theology, but it's a very, very significant thing. You can read piles and piles and piles of books about this and thousands of pages if you'd like. But that's the gist of it. But the debate continues. So there's another council that's called the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Ephesus is in 431, Chalcedon's in 451. And this is the one that comes up with the language that is in the current creed and the current way we think about things. It stretches back to this council. So that the human nature and the divine nature of Jesus are united in such a way that we call the hypostatic union. There's not just a conjunction. It's not like they sit alongside each other. That isn't a strong enough unity to affect salvation. That's the debate. There's a lot more to it, but That's the beginning of it. The thing is that in the West, it's not as much of a debate. Once the Pope has spoken, if you remember, we talked about before how the Pope is kind of the patriarch of the West. He's the one bishop who's sort of over authority of other bishops, that kind of thing. In the East, they have those multiple patriarchates: Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. So in the East, they also have an emperor who gets involved in these things. And the emperor wants the church to make a decision so that there can be political unity. Guess how well that's going to work? Basically, it doesn't. And the emperor gets in trouble for a long time. This is actually, so the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon are what lead to the first major schisms in church history. So a schism is a division in the body of Christ where a group of bishops go their own way. The first group leaves after the Council of Ephesus. And so they're called now the Nestorian churches of the East, or the Assyrian churches of the East. They would be like the Armenian Orthodox and some of those. They're not as well known in our part of the world, but they follow a bishop named Nestorius and a series of teachers. Interestingly enough, in the modern world, there's been large-scale reconciliation between the Catholics and this group, the Assyrian churches of the East. At Chalcedon, the Egyptians and the Africans leave. So this is the rise of the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Copts and the Ethiopians, and the Eritreans, by extension, leave at this point. And there's a bunch of technical language behind this, but suffice it to say that that's the second break. The third break will be called the Great Schism. That happens in 1054. That's with the rest of the Orthodox groups as a whole. Pope Gelasius comes along. Oh, this is funny. Someone cannot live from 492 to 296. That's not how time works. You don't become negative 120. Maybe you should do that at your next birthday. Tell your children that you've actually gone on so long that you've become negative. You're counting down instead of up. But his most famous thing, so it should say 496. His most famous thing is that spiritual authority is superior to secular authority. So the Pope can, spiritual authority in the ranking of things is above that of kings, which most kings don't really like. The kings are like, no, absolutely not. The Pope is like, yep, I'm the boss. Jesus made me the boss. See, I get to be the boss man. Gregory the Great is another one of these popes. He's given the name the Great because, again, he ends up with a huge role in secular matters. And he's a transition to a more medieval kind of way of approaching things. This is a transition to the Middle Ages. He takes over the civil administration of the city of Rome almost entirely because, again, the secular authority is basically worthless. They're sort of putzing. I think by that point, the Eastern Roman Empire had moved its western capital to Ravenna instead of Rome. So Rome is kind of falling to pieces, and there's no one to be in charge. And so the Pope, again, he does things like builds aqueducts and has roads paved and all of those sorts of things. Civil administration of the city of Rome. He also is an important author. He wrote, his most famous work is a series of writings on the book of Job called the Moralia, the Morals of St. Gregory the Great. and it's his commentary on the book of Job. That becomes one of the standard texts for the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were relatively uninventive. So they had a series of things that you read and you did, no matter who you were. That was being educated. So some of them were reading people like Augustine. It's part of why Augustine's writings are preserved. A second person after Augustine was Gregory the Great and St. Jerome. Gregory the Great's Moralia were one of these important things. He also was involved in the evangelization of England. This is part of where the papacy starts to see its role also in terms of its position in the world, that there's peoples outside that are not, they don't have Christian missionaries, and we need to send some. And so, since I'm Pope, it's up to me. And this, again, ends up being a very good thing. So he sends off a man named St. Augustine of Canterbury, not St. Augustine of Hippo, who founds the church, who sort of refounds the church in Canterbury. If you recall from secular history, or we've talked about it before, the Romans at one time had invaded England, and their center was in the land of Kent, where Canterbury is. And so it was an ancient bishopric, but the Anglo-Saxons, when they invade England in the 500s, were rather grouchy people. There are good old Germanic Vikings. And they were not very friendly to the ancient Roman stuff. And they woke up on the wrong side of the bed quite regularly. So they have problems. And so the Christian faith starts declining in that part of the empire, and it's sort of on its way down. And Gregory sends off Augustine, and they kind of I think they adopt the thing of Jesus, so he sends Augustine plus 12 monks. It's like a new Jesus and a new set of apostles. They start doing that. That was actually the favorite thing that the Irish did as well. When they were going to found a new monastery or send a group out to be missionaries to the mainland continent, they would usually send 13. One leader and 12, like a new set of Jesus and the 12 apostles. They were following, they're like, if Jesus did it, that's the way that everyone should do it. Jesus had 12 apostles, we should send out a leader and 12 followers. Over time, the church also comes to own land. And this, again, is one of these puzzles. If you read a lot of modern historians, they'll talk about the church wanting to accumulate wealth and power. Is there some of that? Yes, very likely there is. Human nature is kind of corrupted and fallen and broken and does these things all the time. On the other hand, part of it is also that the church is one of the only stable institutions in society. Like, civil governments rise and fall and collapse all the time because they basically never stop fighting each other. And so the church is one of the only things to stick around. Like, some monasteries become very wealthy, not because they were trying to, especially at first, but because it's like, well, if you give it to anyone else, it'll be gone in a few years. Because they're going to kill that guy, and that guy's going to kill this guy, and this guy's going to steal that guy's land, and on and on and on.